Pete Hegseth made a speech this morning in Europe where he's talking about what the United States is and is not going to do. And it has a lot of people in Ukraine worried, but I think it's going to have a lot of people in the United States breathing a sigh of relief, because really for the first time in this whole war, from a senior American official, you're seeing something that is approximating representing what's actually going on the ground. And we're going to break down some of the comments from Secretary Hegseth today by the inestimable Doug McGregor, Colonel McGregor, former highly decorated combat veteran, CEO of our country, our choice, and just all around great guy. Doug, welcome back to the show.
Sure, Dan. Happy to be here.
Well, listen, let's just get right into it. Some of the things that Secretary Hegseth said today were, I think, a welcome relief. Some of the comments, I mean, he's still saying some things that, I think you have to say to keep a public face. But I think when you both look at the very strident comments he said in a couple of places, along with reading between the lines, I think that we're starting to get an idea of maybe where President Trump is going, where what he hopes to negotiate it into this war. And we'll be real interested to see some of your thoughts on what you think is really going on the ground, or at least behind the scenes. Let's start with the first one here, because Secretary Hegseth says he thinks that finally we're starting to pay attention to the realities on the ground.
We will only end this devastating war and establish a durable peace by coupling allied strength with a realistic assessment of the battlefield. We want, like you, a sovereign and prosperous Ukraine. But we must start by recognizing that returning to Ukraine's pre-2014 borders is an unrealistic objective. Chasing this illusionary goal will only prolong the war and cause more suffering.
I think that's a pretty stark rebuke of Zelensky, who's always talked about actually the 1991 borders. And now then Hegseth is saying you're not even going to get the 2014 borders. What do you make of that?
Well, Secretary Hegseth's comments are a breath of fresh air. They give us hope that we can actually reach some sort of final outcome in the region that could be good for us, good for the Russians, and good for the Europeans. And he's telling the truth. We've struggled with this, as you know, I and many others, for months and months and months. And the media has pushed back with just an inexhaustible source of lies about how well things are going for Ukraine, and the Russians are miserable and they're losing and they're committing atrocities. All of that was nonsense. So I think what he's saying, he's subtle, which he has to be, obviously, but he's making it clear the future is not going to look like the past, so you can hang up any expectations or hopes that we're going to commit to some long-term reversal of the gains in this war by the Russians.
Now, you've had Zelensky here in recent days trying to, I guess, entice President Trump by saying, look, I'm gonna make a deal with you. I'm going to give you a whole bunch of rare earths. And President Trump himself, in an interview with Bret Baier a couple of days ago, said, yeah, I want like $500 million worth of this stuff. But what neither one of them have actually said is what they think that they're going to get for that. I don't know if it's I think Trump is thinking it's going to be a repayment for all the money we've already given, but Zelensky seems to think he's going to get something out of it. What do you think is best you can read the tea leaves? Does Zelensky even think he's going to get from Trump by offering this so-called deal?
First of all, anything that Zelensky says deserves to be treated with serious skepticism. The rare earth deposits that we know of are in the Crimea and in eastern Ukraine. These areas are controlled by the Russians. They're historically Russian. They're Russian again, and that's not going to change. I don't know if anybody has briefed President Trump on that. So this is not a department store where you're unhappy with your purchase and you want to go back and get your money. I don't think that's going to happen. And I don't see how we extract any price from anybody for the stupidity of what the Biden administration has undertaken. In fact, I hope President Trump is going to look into this massive sum of money that belonged to the Russians that we effectively confiscated with the goal of turning it over to the Ukrainians, especially as it becomes increasingly clear how hundreds of billions of dollars and euros and so forth have disappeared into the black hole and ended up in Zelensky's bank account along with a number of his criminal buddies. So hopefully President Trump will recognize that that's not going to happen.
Now, one of the things that that Zelensky has been floating of late, and of course he's floated a lot of stuff, so I take it with a grain of salt, but he wants a ceasefire on somewhere along the current line of contacts. He wants up to 200,000 peacekeepers to patrol this, sort of like a Korea split kind of situation. And he's also talking about he wants some kind of security guarantees. Now, the Secretary Hegseth here talked about the security guarantees, but I think with a couple of pretty important caveats.
Any security guarantee must be backed by capable European and non-European troops. If these troops are deployed as peacekeepers to Ukraine at any point, they should be deployed as part of a non-NATO mission, and they should not be covered under Article 5. There also must be robust international oversight of the line of contact. To be clear, as part of any security guarantee, there will not be U.S. troops deployed to Ukraine.
Okay, so I'm certainly happy to hear him categorically say there will be no American troops, anything involved with this. And he also said no NATO. What do you think of those two caveats?
Well, I think they're helpful. At this point, I don't know what Moscow is willing to accept. Moscow has been very resistant, obviously, anything with the NATO label on it. But I'm not really sure that Moscow wants to see any foreign troops at all on Ukrainian soil. Now, these are where the details become important. Are these non-NATO forces going to go in and, quote unquote, demilitarize Ukraine? In other words, are they going to remove any of the remaining equipment that poses a threat to Russia? Are they going to have a hand in policing the place to ensure that there are not underground cells being secretly supplied by MI6 or CIA to start another insurgency against Russia? I don't know. I mean, these are the kinds of things the Russians are going to ask. Again, I think this is a move in the right direction, but I don't think there's any interest in freezing anything along any lines of contact at this point. I think the Russians are going to take the position when you come back and you have a real proposal that is going to meet our needs, our security needs, we'll talk. That hasn't happened yet. Now, that doesn't mean this is not better than what we saw before. And it's hard to judge what Moscow will accept. But remember, the Russians have lost, 90,000 dead. I don't know the numbers of wounded, but fortunately, half of those or more have been returned to duty, and another 10,000 non-Russian army dead. In other words, people that are not part of this Russian army per se. That's a lot of people under any circumstances, far more than we lost in Vietnam. And the difference between Vietnam and what's happened in Ukraine is clear and unambiguous. The Russians have won. So they're not going to give much up unless they're absolutely certain of what this outcome looks like. So I think that's a huge improvement. The fact that there will be no Americans involved is nice. But again, I think the Russians would also like a larger security architecture. And that's something that President Trump should be very interested in, because he was always interested in reducing our profile overseas, particularly in Europe, also in Northeast Asia. And a new security architecture is the way to do that.
Danny, would you please take note of what Trump just put up on Truth Social just a few minutes ago here about a conversation he has had with President Putin?
That's interesting. I can't really read all that on the screen here, but hopefully he's saying that this is something that's going to reduce any confusion on the battlefield. And one wonders, and who knows, whatever he's written here, I can only imagine that's going to be, for public release, and we don't know what was really discussed here. But let's just kind of, based on what you see on the ground and what you know of Russia, Doug, what would you expect that Putin? What is the message from Putin to Trump? And do you think, if this conversation took place as he said?
First and foremost, what President Putin will want are confidential discussions. He's not interested in, grabbing the stage for a big splash in the media that something great has happened and I, Donald Trump, have done it. If President Trump wants this to succeed, President Trump should go back to saying what I heard him say the other day. We're talking and we're making progress. Thank you. Next question. Stop talking about the details. Don't get into it. Hegseth did a good job thus far. Let's leave it there. And if we're going to send the envoy over, let that all happen behind closed doors and let nothing be leaked or shared until there is substantive agreement. You'll recall back in the 80s, people used to talk about, let's have a Gorbachev summit. It became a metaphor for the major heads of state showing up and agreeing to something after there had been long, exhausting negotiations to get an agreement. Well, I think that's where we need to go now. So I hope that whatever the president says, he's going to go back to what he said before. We're talking, we're making progress. Thanks very much. That's the right answer. And what Hegseth has said is encouraging, but it's not an end state. The only end state really of great importance to us is that NATO has nothing to do with Ukraine and no American forces will be involved. That's good news. The rest of it, I think, is negotiable, and we'll have to wait and see what happens.
Yeah, I was reading part of that as you were talking there, and basically the only thing he said about the end state was, well, I think we can get, quote, common sense outcome. And as long as we're both applying the same standard of what common sense is, then we have some possibilities here. And toward that end, I want to get back to Secretary Hegseth here, because he was saying that we're looking for a durable peace, but again, with an important caveat.
A durable peace for Ukraine must include robust security guarantees to ensure that the war will not begin again. This must not be Minsk 3.0. That said, the United States does not believe that NATO membership for Ukraine is a realistic outcome of a negotiated settlement.
Okay, so it's good to that, but this is the one part of it that gives me a little bit of pause when he says that there must be security guarantees and we don't want a Minsk 3.0. Now, on that last point there, you may find some common agreement with the Russian side, because they don't want a Minsk 3.0 because the Russians feel like that was the disaster. Hegseth is talking there almost like he thinks it's from the Western point that Minsk 1.0 and 2.0 were failures. What is your assessment of the whole Minsk analogy?
Well, before we go to the Minsk business, let's keep in mind that everything that Secretary Hegseth has said has been said by the Russians for months. He's simply repeating back to the Russians what they've said. So that's fine. I happen to have agreed with that from the very beginning. When it comes to security guarantees, depends on how you interpret that. This is back to the idea of a larger security architecture, which is designed to prevent any further outbreak in the future. So I think we're getting closer and closer and closer to the point where the Russians will talk to us, because we're effectively repeating back to them what they've been saying for months, and they were always ignored by Biden. Now, as far as Minsk goes, remember that Minsk, as we now know, and Macron has said this as well, not just Mrs. Merkel, who was in the chancellorship at the time in Germany, was designed to buy time for this Ukrainian reactionary criminal state to build up an army and a force with which it could attack Russia. Now, that's what we mean when we don't want another Minsk round, because it was meaningless. There was no intention on the part of the West to ever implement anything. And the sad part is that ultimately between 2014 and the outbreak or the beginning of this intervention by the Russians in 2022, more than 14,000 Russians in Donetsk and Luhansk were killed by the incessant attacks by the Ukrainians. So I think, that's what we need to understand about Minsk. Minsk was a fraud, and it was perpetrated to confuse and mislead and beguile the Russians. So when he says no more Minsk, I think he's sending a signal, as is Donald Trump, we're not going to go down that road. I hope so, because one of the things that we've got to be certain of is that we tell the truth. You can lie in a domestic context, as most politicians do, about a lot of things. In international relations between great powers, you have to be absolutely truthful.
And on that regard, and especially talking about the Minsk and where this is going, I think we have to take a second to look at the hand the negotiating hand, the leverage that Trump does and doesn't have in terms of what kind of an outcome he's going to get. And I think that, and I'd like your view on this, I think that history is going to be really ugly to the Biden administration and really to the West writ large. And that includes virtually all of NATO heading back into the time before the invasion happened, going back into 2021, because obviously we had the Minsk agreements. At any time we could have compelled Ukraine to just abide by the terms that we helped negotiate, and there would never, almost certainly, have never been a war. But then we systematically sabotaged every opportunity to either prevent the war right before it happened or any of a number of negotiating possibilities. We kept on sabotaging those, and we had Secretary of Defense Austin, who said, early in the war that our objective was to, quote, weaken Russia. Well, now then, the cost for that effort is probably, and I think you've said it a couple of times, and the evidence, I think, supports it, somewhere close to 1 million Ukrainian deaths so far, certainly the loss of a lot of territory, and yet we have a Russia that's not only not weakened, but now it's a lot stronger than it was. I wonder if you can talk about a little bit about how much stronger Russia is, because I think some still don't understand that.
Well, this is important to understand that whenever I've been critical of President Trump on the question of what to do about Ukraine since he took office, I fully support the president on his domestic policies, and I think they're going in the right direction. He set a lot of positive forces in motion. Strongly support those. My concern has always been not to be distracted by events overseas, that if he could lose control here at home, because there are far more serious crises that are closer to us, and that's where he should focus. Now, having said that, I think we have to understand a couple of things. He came in and he adopted this false narrative that had been spun up over the previous years in London and Langley, and then repeated ad nauseum by the media, that we're all willing servants of this war. He's got to sweep that aside. He's got to get back to basics and go back to something that he did indicate a long time ago. This is not his. He did not start this. He did not want this. He said repeatedly it wouldn't have happened had he been there, fine. But now he needs to make it very clear this is not his, and he wants to end it. Now, he doesn't have to get a quote-unquote win over the Russians. Believe me, if he ends this, he gets a win at home, here, with the American people. They don't want anything to do with this war with Russia, and certainly don't want the risk of any kind of nuclear conflagration. Absolutely not. So that's his win. The Europeans win because they're ultimately going to replace these terrible governments, these globalists that have sacrificed over 1 million Ukrainian lives and hundreds of thousands of Russians to nothing. For no purpose, when it was completely unnecessary. They need to go away, and they need to be expelled and removed. Now, as far as whether or not NATO survives, I don't think it will. I think NATO is increasingly an empty facade, and it may be one of these things, well, it ended with a whimper, not a bang. It may just quietly sink into the abyss and vanish. It's not meaningful. And frankly, at this point, from an American standpoint, that's fine. The United States doesn't need it. What we need is good relations with everybody in Europe, and we don't need to have to garrison the place to get those. So I think all of this is bound up with what President Trump is thinking, and I'm really glad to hear the things that Secretary Hegseth has said, because they are a breath of fresh air.
Indeed. In fact, also in that same conversation from Hegseth, he specifically talked about the potential future of NATO.
Safeguarding European security must be an imperative for European members of NATO. As part of this, Europe must provide the overwhelming share of future lethal and non-lethal aid to Ukraine.
Now, I think this is one where there may be a lot of other things meant inside of this about NATO itself, not just about Ukraine, because he's saying, hey, whatever's going to happen in Ukraine, you guys got to handle it. And you need to pick up a lot more of your the cost of NATO itself. Do you see this potentially as Trump laying the groundwork for we're going to continue to take a step back from NATO?
President Trump made it very clear to me and anybody else who cared to listen to him years ago that he thought the Europeans should be their own first responders. In other words, this reliance on U.S. forces to go thousands of miles from the continental United States into Europe to marshal air and naval power on a moment's notice to defend Europe was ridiculous. It didn't make any sense. It didn't make any sense from the threat standpoint because Russia doesn't present that kind of threat, nor is Russia interested in it. And he's tried repeatedly to persuade the Europeans they must be responsible for their own defense. I think what probably President Trump would like, and I'm sure Secretary Hegseth would probably be receptive to this, is that fine, if this NATO thing survives, that's great, but you've got to take the lead. And remember, all the times you and I have spoken, the op-eds I wrote saying over and over and over again, a European four-star should replace the American four-star. We've got to get out of the business of taking responsibility for the command and defense of the European theater. That's not our problem. And I think at the end of the day, I think that's really what Secretary Hegseth is saying. Let's get out of this. We'll backstop you. We will stand by you, in the event of a serious conflagration. We'll back you up. But you've got to take the lead and defend yourselves. I think that's very clear. I think that's what President Trump wants, and he should want it, and the Congress should want it. But we all know Congress will fight it because you're disrupting a money flow that's become very, very useful for a lot of people, only not the American people.
Now, let's go down that path for a minute, because I think it's really important. There are a number of voices, both in the United States and definitely in Europe, that are in near panic fear that Trump is going to, get us out of NATO, et cetera, as though that's going to be something that's going to put our national security at great risk or so. I wonder if you can discuss something, because to me, taking the emotion out of it and whatever financial obligations some people may have, or benefits rather, is that when you just look at the fundamentals, wait a minute, when we started NATO in 1949, Europe was still in rubble for the most part from World War II, and economies and militaries, et cetera. And there was a need for U.S., especially to face off against the Soviet threat. But now then you've got all these very, very wealthy countries. And what is your argument against the people who say that we should stay there literally forever, as opposed to saying, no, each of these nations should get back to the historical norm and provide for their own security? What is so bad about that?
Well, there's a vast difference between seeking to preserve the freedom and liberty of nations in the aftermath of a terrible war that did not fall under communist occupation, and staying somewhere in perpetuity on the grounds that if we leave, there may be disputes or conflicts. Well, I have a newsflash. There have been disputes and conflicts all over the world for thousands of years, long before we existed. There will be more conflicts and disputes after we're dead. In other words, once we leave, will there be a potential for disputes and conflicts? Yes. But the Europeans, certainly before the First World War, demonstrated pretty conclusively after the Napoleonic Wars that they could handle those things. I think we're living in a different age now. I don't see any interest in Germany, among any Germans, in invading France, or the French are not interested in fighting with the Italians or the Spaniards. I mean, this stuff's over with. Eastern Europe, there's some unfinished business, let's be frank. And that's going to come to the fore. Hungary lost a great deal in World War I, and even more after the Second World War. That's unfinished business. There's unfinished business for them in Ukraine. There's unfinished business with Poland in Ukraine. But these things are not our affair. And these things will have to be sorted out regionally. I think the world collectively, ever since the 1970s, has been moving towards greater regionalization, Dan. In other words, instead of seeing the global community as a community, we need to see the global population organized into regions with major powers in each of the region that operate as arbitrators and maintain peace, security, and build prosperity. This is something that was predicted by a man named Hedley Bull at Oxford, long before anybody wrote The Fourth Turning or Toffler's Waves or anything else. I think we're there. I think Europe will devolve to some extent into new regions, because the problem in NATO was always the same. The view of things from Berlin did not match the view from Madrid, and the view from Paris had nothing to do with the view from Stockholm or Athens. And that's more true now than ever. So I think you're going to see new security arrangements emerge, which is fine. They should, because they have a greater chance of succeeding than anything we impose. And right now, NATO is a legacy of our imposition. Let's be frank. That's
and another thing, Doug, this is there has been, and I've heard this many times throughout most of my adult life, is that the view in the United States, especially, is that, well, look, we quote had to go to Europe to help them in World War I, and then we had to go back in World War II to help them. So we need to keep all this stuff going now in NATO into perpetuity, because otherwise we'll have to go back again. That's just how it is. That seems to me kind of an arrogant assumption, then also that you can predict the future. But let's look at the fundamental of that. Would the United States, quote, have to go back to Europe and fight a war if any of those groupings you just mentioned turn into conflict?
Well, if you're asking how do we intervene militarily, is that the question?
No, the question is, should we intervene? Is that something in America's interest to do?
No, I don't think so. And the other issue is, how can we? Eisenhower pointed out when he was president, a group of Army generals came in to but make presentations to the president about their need for more transportation to move more forces to Europe. And they said they had to have 29 divisions in Europe to stop the Soviets. And he said, how many divisions have you got that you could conceivably send? Well, we only have 15 divisions. He said, well, then find out what the shipping requirements are and the aviation requirements are to move 15 divisions. You're not getting anything more than that. Well, that took the wind out of their sails. But then he privately pointed out, look, we're never going to get across the Atlantic and the Pacific again the way we did during World War II. It can't be done, or World War I. The submarines, the long-range precision strike, the growing overhead constellation of ISR, he said this is going to be impossible. So if we put something over there, it stands an excellent chance of ending up at Dunkirk, a giant Dunkirk. And even then, we may never get the troops out. I mean, one of the things people don't realize is that Dunkirk was a miracle, simply because Hitler stopped the advance of the Germans. Had they advanced, you'd have had 300,000 prisoners of war without any trouble at all. It would be much worse today. So the whole idea, this old paradigm, is dead. We can't repeat any of that. So the answer is no. The Europeans must take the lead. They must take responsibility for their own security.
We actually had Colonel Jacques Beau, a former NATO officer, on the show last week, who made that one of those very important points there also, that in the event of a new general war, he said the United States would have almost no ability to move the vast quantities of equipment and ammunition and everything else, which would have to come by sea because of all the things you mentioned there. So he said you could try, but it would almost certainly end up at the majority of the bottom, because the U.S. doesn't have the requisite anti-submarine capacity to be able to do that. And it would take years to build. So then that leads me to the question, Doug, what is the best way for the United States to ensure its national security? What should we focus on if we're interested in making sure we stay safe so we don't get into a war we don't need to fight or lose our military trying to get there?
Well, our focus really ought to be on the Western Hemisphere. Defense of the Western Hemisphere is critical now. Our country's in a lot of trouble. Our open borders have created chaos here inside the United States. And that's what's most important at all. There's going to be very little that we can do beyond our borders. We're in a position very similar to the British Empire at the turn of the century. The British Empire had a marvelous navy. We have a good navy. We have good air forces. There are places we can go if we need to temporarily, but we cannot become a permanent presence anywhere, because we are ultimately a maritime and aerospace country. We're not a land power anywhere but in the continental United States, which is why I keep arguing you got to get the Army back here, and you got to get the Army back in the business of national defense, which is defense of our borders, defense of the United States. So that's the first answer to the question. The second part of it is, yes, in small numbers, depending upon the situation, we can lend support or assistance to someone. But even then, it's very risky. The British tried to rescue the Greeks who came under attack by the Italians and the Germans. and the great British Navy did all that it could, but it was no match for the German Air Force and the German Army. And it would play out very similarly with the Russians. So I'm afraid we've got to be very careful about promises we make that we can never keep. So we ought to back away, encourage people to do what is in their interest, and consider carefully the limitations of our abilities to support anybody else beyond the Western Hemisphere.
Well, that certainly makes a lot of sense to me. And then that's something that we actually have the resources and the capacity to do. We can keep ourselves safe in there, but I just fear that too many people think it's still either 1970 or 1945 for that matter, and that we can just do all of these things without even looking at do we actually have the capacity to do it? And what does the other side have the capacity to prevent that they didn't have back then? But I guess we're not going to change the world overnight here. Real quick, I want to get back to the one of the last things that Secretary Hegseth said in this thing here in his interview today, which I think might be, I won't say a mistake, but I'm not sure that they're tracking accurately on what's possible here with Russia. So in this last clip here, you have Hegseth talking about how Trump is going to be able to pressure Russia to the negotiating table.
To further enable effective diplomacy and drive down energy prices that fund the Russian war machine. President Trump is unleashing American energy production and encouraging other nations to do the same. Lower energy prices, coupled with more effective enforcement of energy sanctions, will help bring Russia to the table.
So let's look at two parts of that. First of all, does the United States have any leverage, oil price aside, I want to talk about that separately, to force Russia to the negotiating table? Because it seems to me Russia is already very eager to come to the negotiating table as long as we understand what the fundamentals are.
Exactly. The notion that you're going to force the Russians into anything at this point, particularly in Ukraine, is absurd. That would be similar to saying, we're going to force the Americans to come to terms with the Mexicans, and you're sitting in Beijing. It's absurd. It's not going to happen. It's ridiculous. We need to stop talking about that. But this is part of the national narcissism, which is almost terminal inside the Beltway. People can't step away from the possibility that our power is not limitless. The other thing is, given the way things are going in the Middle East, you could be in a major regional war in 30 days, and the price for a barrel of oil could go to $90 or $100 a barrel overnight. So I think this is all nonsense about energy. We're not going to threaten the Russians in any way, shape, or form in a way that makes any sense. Look, what have we done for years? I mean, this hostility to Russia, what good has it done? It's been self-defeating. If there's a lesson to be learned from this disastrous Biden administration, is it's all self-defeating. So let's drop all this silly language and nonsense about how great we are and how we can force this or that. It's all trash. Get rid of it. Dump it. We need to learn a little humility. We're not the only player on the block.
Indeed. And humility doesn't mean that self-deprecating and weak, because we can be powerful and humility at the same time, leading to a good outcome. But I want to look at that, because I know you've studied this a little bit too, the energy issue. If you were somehow to manipulate the market, and I don't know that you even could, but if you were able to drive it down to $45 a barrel, that may be good for the price of gasoline for you and me. But for the oil producers in the United States, they have to have a higher price per barrel to make continuing to seek this fuel. It has to be economically viable for them. Otherwise, they'll lose money because the cost of extraction continues to arise. Do you think the U.S. Oil industry would support barrel of price at $45?
Well, you're pointing to a contradiction that, unfortunately, the politicians fall into all the time, including President Trump. It needs to stop. First of all, we're going to reinvigorate the energy industry. We're going to drill, baby, drill. Well, first of all, we're a long way behind where we were a few years ago. We are not extracting nearly as much as we did. The shale extraction is not developing dramatically at this point. We haven't built new rigs. We haven't built any new refineries. I mean, I could go down the list. The oil industry has had no incentive to invest in anything new. because every time they turned around, Washington hit them over the head with all this environmental business. And of course, that's hurt us as a country, hurt us as a nation. So you're not going to get anywhere very quickly just because you say, I want to drill for oil and I want more oil and I want more gasoline. Forget it. It doesn't work that way. It's not a switch, that you switch on. That's the first part. And I think the second part is very obvious what you've said. If you were to destroy that price, it would hurt us here very, very badly. This is not going to work. This is a dumb idea. This once again assumes that we're the center of the universe and that we can drive prices everywhere. We can't. Our market is not the only market anymore. We've been through this how many times? The Chinese, last year we had $1 trillion trade deficit. Last year they had $1 trillion trade surplus. They have more manufacturing capability and power than the United States and Europe combined. It is China that right now and for the foreseeable future is going to be the economic engine driving everything on this planet. That doesn't mean we're bad or weak or falling behind. For most of the last 2,000 years, China was the largest driving market in the world. It's not a new phenomenon. China simply regained what it had 100, 200, 300 years ago. So we got to stop talking in these foolish terms, because the only people that are impressed with that are the few Americans at home that don't know anything, that are out of touch with reality and like hearing wonderful things about themselves. The rest of the world just looks at us like, how stupid can you be? And they're right. We're being very stupid right now.
Well, hopefully we'll get that squared away. I do find some optimism in some of the things Secretary Hicks has said. It is definitely a
Indeed.
here. Yeah. And let's just encourage that to continue going that direction. Well, listen, before we let you go today, I want to ask you what's going on at OCOC, because I understand that you've got a new show coming out, Soldier, Statesman, Scholar. That the middle part there, the statesman, is what has almost been eradicated in the United States. So I'm all for that. Tell us a little bit about this.
Well, this show shamelessly borrows from the Tucker Carlson model and also from some other shows that people have seen on television. But it's an effort to get at the truth. This is going to be every Tuesday and every Thursday starting in the middle of March. And I think people will find it interesting. We're certainly going to make it entertaining, but this is a take no prisoners approach. We're interested in the truth. We're going to bring on guests, although we're not going to have some unending stream of celebrity guests like Taylor Swift every week. In fact, I don't think Taylor Swift's coming at all. But My point is that we're going to talk to real Americans, people that are informed, people with opinions. And I think it's going to be interesting for people. We're also going to go visit a couple of places around the country. We'll get out of the studio. We're not going to stay wedded to the studio here in Orlando. And we'll visit some places I think will be of great interest to Americans. We're interested in also reminding Americans of our great cultural, historical achievements, why they're worth defending, why they're worth having, why they're worth revisiting and reminding ourselves about, and also do what we can to highlight what's critical, exactly what we've done here today with regard to many of the great remarks made by Secretary Hegseth.
Well, that's fantastic. I couldn't be any more excited to see that, and really grateful for that moving in that direction. And I think people are starting to see a rejection in larger scale of the major media. I mean, I've just seen headline after headline in the last, really even just the last few months of like MSNBC, CNN, I think even Fox News, ABC, NBC News, everybody's bleeding viewers because they're tired of just the same old thing and they're tired of not being told the truth. So something like this that's talking about we're going to elevate the truth and then talk to regular Americans as well and go and think, I think that's a surefire winner.
Well, this is going to be on the Republic platform. You can go to republic.us and find that platform. It's going to stream live. Ultimately, over time, the various episodes, right now we're working on the first 15 episodes. They will become available on other platforms as well. But initially, you got to be on Republic, and in order to watch this, I think it has a good shot. I mean, we never know. It's sort of like crossing the line of departure in the war. You figure you're going to probably win, but until you meet the enemy in battle, you're not completely sure. So I think that's the same thing here. But I think this is I think we have a good chance of putting out something very good. And remember, the show's easy. It's just McGregor.
Yeah, good title that you can't forget, and a lot that goes underneath that. Well, thanks for sharing that with us today, Doug. We really appreciate it, and seriously look forward to seeing it, and look forward to having you back on our show very soon.
Okay, Dan. Thanks a lot.
All right, thanks, Bud, and we appreciate you.